My contention is that the sheer volume of abstraction in software, and indeed in technology generally, means that no one even knows how things work anymore, and it also leads to inferior products. Think about, for example, the Japanese cars of the 90s. I used to work on them with my best mate all the time when I was a young guy, and we knew how everything worked. We would replace the exhaust, we would swap the engines out. We could do pretty much anything. And the same thing goes for code. Now, if you use VS Code, you're probably familiar with all the plethora of plugins that are available. And that's well and good. There's a time and a place for a fully fledged IDE. The same thing goes for NeoVim. If you use NeoVim on a day-to-day basis like I do, then you want to have all of the power that is available to make that a really smooth and productive experience. I'm not advocating against plugins. However, there's a time and a place. If you're a newcomer to NeoVim, then you might be overwhelmed by all of these different plugin options. And you kind of need to be an expert in order to get your NeoVim configuration working. I know that you can use off-the-shelf options like NVChad, but we don't do that around here, all right? In fact, using NeoVim and plugins is not that difficult, but the on-ramp is kind of difficult. You have to go from this kind of noob, NPC, VS Code situation where you really don't need to know anything, and then you go all the way into NeoVim where you need to kind of build your own configuration. There is also a time and a place for just having a really, really lightweight NeoVim config. I often say working in a server or on a machine, and I just don't want to have to deal with installing every single dependency and plugin to get my NeoVim config working without errors and that kind of thing. So what we're going to do today in this video is we're going to strip NeoVim down entirely. We're not going to use even a single plugin. And by doing this, I'm going to show you that you can get like 90% of what you need just with NeoVim, which is an incredibly powerful tool in and of itself. The final thing is, if you are a newcomer to NeoVim, this is the perfect place to start because you don't have to deal with all the complexity or how complicated it is to set the entire thing up. And you can therefore get started with NeoVim, and perhaps after a month or two, you can scale up to adding in plugins as you feel comfortable. So let's go. Everything that I'm going to show you is going to be available on the GitHub repository, the NVim Lite GitHub repository against my user account. So that's public. You can go and check that out as I move through here. If you need any of these commands or you like this configuration, you can just copy it from there. So the first thing that we've got to do when we want to use NeoVim, of course, is to install it. Now, if you're on Arch, then you want to use pacman. If you're on something like Mac, then you would use brew install NeoVim. So the command for myself is going to be sudo pacman syu, always keep your system up to date, and then NeoVim, okay? So obviously, if you're on Mac, it's going to be brew install NeoVim. Okay, so assuming that you've got your NeoVim installed, now what we can do is we can have a look at NeoVim. We can simply run the command nvim, and it'll tell you the version, and it's going to give you some information. For example, there's a few commands that you can run out of the box. One of those commands, for example, is checkhealth, which is an interesting command, and it can give you an overview on anything which might be out of date or any dependencies of it. However, we'll get into that later. The first thing that we want to do is we want to create a configuration file, because as we saw just then when we were using NeoVim, it's not really that customized yet. So NeoVim knows to look inside of the .config and then init.lua file. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a directory, and we're going to do that recursively and create the path if it doesn't already exist. I'm going to put that in config, and in here we're going to have a NeoVim or NVim directory. So go and change into that directory with config nvim. And in here what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a file. It's going to be called init.lua. So NeoVim knows to look into this directory path, and it knows to look for a file called init.lua. In this case I'll be using Lua. Lua is a very simple scripting language, and if you're familiar with JavaScript or Python, it's going to be very easy to pick up. And typically it's better to use Lua than VimScript with NeoVim. Not only because it's easier, but all the plugins are written in it, and you'll find your way around pretty quickly. So let's go in and have a look at the init.lua. So this empty file, I don't have any line numbers, I've got no relative line numbers. So it's kind of annoying, but one of the first things that people do when they create their NeoVim configurations is they apply a theme. But did you know, in fact, that NeoVim has out of the box its own color schemes available? So we can simply type in the command color scheme, and we can move through all of these. So let's say my favorite is Unokai, okay? And it's changing the color scheme. Now, it might not be that obvious yet, but in a moment it will be, because we'll add some text. So I'm going to just paste in the color scheme. And also, if you noticed earlier, my terminal, I'm using Alacrity, but you can achieve transparency in pretty much any major terminal. So I'm also going to set transparency here. So the color scheme, as I mentioned, that I like is Unokai, and that's available built in with NeoVim. And then I'm going to be setting transparency here. So let's go and let's source our NeoVim init.lua file, and now we can see we've got a color scheme and we also have that transparency. So it's already starting to look much better. Okay, so next I'm going to apply a number of kind of boring but nevertheless very important quality of life settings, and we do that with the vim.opt command, okay, in Lua. And for example, here I want to have line numbers, and I also want to have relative line numbers, cursor line, so I can highlight the current cursor line. It's not doing that for me at the moment. I want it to wrap. By default, I want it to not wrap, but I can always turn that off if I'm reading text files or whatever it may be. Scroll off means that if I get close to the bottom of the file, 10 lines, it's going to push it down so that, you know, my cursor doesn't get too close to the bottom, and it makes it easier to read and reason about where I am. Then I've got double space for tab, for example, and auto indent from some search items, so that we want to ignore the case so that we can use smart case. So for example, if I want to search for a certain string within my text code, then I don't want to be restricted to the exact case of it, and therefore I'm going to turn it off. But if it turns out that I start to use capitalization, then Vim will be smart enough to look for that. I'm also going to turn off highlight search, and I'm going to show the matches as I type with inc or incremental search, okay? Items or options, when they come together, they definitely improve the visual look. For example, we've got better coloring, I've got a sign column, and also a color column. So we're going to see, for example, certain signs on the gutter, and we're also going to see a column. I like it to be 100 lines, so I typically don't like my code to go beyond 100 lines. And then show matching brackets, and then how long that should be applied for, and then some completion options. We're not going to show the mode, for example, whether we're in normal mode or command mode or insert mode, because we're going to be creating our own custom status line, and I'll show you how to do it later in the video. And then we've got a pop-up menu height and win blend, for example, and the pop-up menu blend refer to the transparency. Finally, I've got some obscure ones like don't hide markup, and then conceal cursor and lazy redraw. So this is some things that pertain to macros. And then next, something which is really, really useful when we are in NeoVim. I don't want to create backups, and that's why I'm setting these to false. However, I do want to have an undo directory. So that means that when I make changes in a file and I go back to that file, it will remember the changes that I've made and I can undo them, right? And then I've got a few things here for faster completion. I've got the undo dir that I just mentioned, and we also set auto read. So if the file changes in another context, say another program is reading the file, we're going to auto reload that. Under behavior settings, I'm going to have a few things like hidden buffers on, and then I'm going to have error bells, and then we've got some improved backspace behavior. I don't want to change automatically the directory as I move throughout the directory tree. And then I want keywords, for example, if we had something like Python language, this would be treated as one word because it just has a dash, the hyphen. So, you know, I kind of tend to see that as a full word. And then we want to have the append. So, for example, when we later look into NeoVim's built-in fuzzy finding capabilities, I'm going to put these two asterisks, and this means that we're going to also look into subdirectories. It'll make sense when we get to that point. Then also I'm going to allow the mouse, and I'm going to append the unnamed plus to the clipboard. This means if we copy something in our NeoVim session, then it's going to be available on our clipboard, so if we want to paste it into the browser. There's a few other items here like encoding and so forth. And then the final one under what I would call our basic settings is the GUI cursor. Now, like I mentioned, all of this is going to be included in the repository in a single file. It's super easy to access and reason about. So I'm really just introducing all of this to you. You don't need to memorize it. Now the GUI cursor, of course, this just changes the look and feel of my cursor. So for example, right now when I go into insert mode, it just goes into that tiny one. I don't like that so much. I prefer the block cursor, and I also prefer it to flash. I guess maybe because I use Linux, I want to know that the system's still up or something like that. Therefore, I'm going to apply these cursor settings, and now I'm going to write this file, and we're going to source the file, and now you can immediately see that everything's totally changed. All right, we have over here, we've got this 100 line column, we've got the line number and the relative line numbers, and then of course we've got a lot of behaviors under the hood which may not immediately be obvious, but as you're using NeoVim, they will become real quality of life improvements. And you can also see just one more thing there, which is that the row is highlighted. Let's now move on to the more sophisticated stuff. We've done the theme and we've done the basic settings, I would call them. Okay, so now moving on to some additional options that I guess are a little bit more complicated to understand, but as you're getting more and more familiar with NeoVim, this will be really, really elementary stuff within a couple of weeks. So one of the things in Vim is that we can always move to the end of the line with the $sign, and we can move to the start of the line with the zero key. And of course, if we move to the end of the line, but we want to move to the first significant letter, we can use the caret. The caret will take us to the beginning of the significant space or the first word on the line. Okay, now the thing is that by default yanking doesn't. So let's say if I just wanted to get from set and yank, then it would not actually do that. But so what we're going to do here is we're going to apply that yank to the end of the line. So now if I paste that, you can see I've just yanked everything from set onwards. Okay, and now the next thing is that we want to center the screen when jumping around. So we can use Control U to move up and then Control D to move down. That's just one of the ways. Okay, there are many ways to do this. However, if you see there, what it's doing is it's keeping the cursor in the middle of the screen, and so our eyes can stay in the center of the screen. We're not jumping up to the top of the window or the bottom of the window. It just makes life a lot easier. Okay, then the next thing, we're going to get into buffers a little bit later, but I use these shortcuts just to move between the previous and the next buffer, and I use that doing the leader key. Okay, now to set shortcuts with the leader key, we actually need to set our map leader. So the leader key, you can use whatever you would like. In my case, I just use space, and it just means this is going to activate additional shortcuts on your keyboard, right? So if I have, for example, here leader, that would be in my case space, and then BN, it means the next buffer. Okay, and if I'm just going to save this file to demonstrate in the next section, so here in the next splitting and resizing, I've got it so that I can vertically split and horizontally split. So if I hit space, which is my leader key, and then SV, it's going to vertically split into two windows, and now I can see that the leader key is the prefix there in terms of that shortcut. Here I've also got some additional shortcuts just for resizing the window, so I can hold control and move left and right and that kind of thing. And I've also got shortcuts just for the window navigation itself. So for example, I can move with Control H and J, and here if I split horizontally, then I can move up and down with Control J and K. One thing that I really liked from VS Code back in the day, and I know I was ragging on it earlier, but I really liked this idea that you could say select text and you could move it up and down. In this case, I'm in visual mode and I've selected this text, and now I can just hold Alt and then K and then J, and I'm moving it up and down, and that just is a super handy thing. If you say you just want to move one line up or outside of a function, you can just use that. Next, in visual mode, one thing which is kind of better is here I'm going to select this visually, and then I'm going to hit shift and then the greater than symbol, and it's going to keep it selected. So even after it's shifted it across, it's going to then reselect it in visual mode. And that just makes it a whole lot easier when we're trying to indent things and change the formatting. I mentioned a moment ago, we set up append. If you recall up here, we said append, and then we had a double asterisk. And I said that was important because our path needs to include subdirectories. The reason being is that NeoVim actually has this fuzzy finder built in to it, okay? And so here we've got two commands. One of them is explore and the other one is find. So I'm going to demonstrate first explore. Let's go, and I'm going to hit leader and then E, and here this is netrw, and it's a fully capable file explorer. Okay, you can see from the shortcuts up the top, we've got delete, rename, sort by, we can create directories and so on and so forth. Okay, I'm going to go back one directory and you can see all of the different programs that I have in their configuration files on my system. But now let's say I want to get back into my init.lua. Well, I can simply say leader double F, and now I'm in find. Okay, and now what I can do is I can say init, and I just hit tab, and now it's completed that for me, and it's found the init.lua file, but it's not even in this directory that I'm presently looking at in netrw. And so now I can hit find, okay, and open it, and we can see that we're back into that file that we wanted. Okay, so now just to demonstrate, I'm going to go to another directory. It's a bit more complicated. So let's go to the Qtile, and in here I've been working on this. I'm going to give you guys a tutorial soon on writing Qtile. Now the thing is, in here I have a bunch of files, but I also know that I've got one in another spot. It's called auto start, so I'm just going to open it like that. Now there might be something about my configuration. I'm in a different area and I just want to go and edit my configuration. And so what I can do is I can just say leader RC, and now I'm in the configuration file that we've been working on in this video. So that's just a handy shortcut there. Okay, so speaking of kind of useful things, sometimes I need to know exactly the file that I'm in, and I need the direct path to it. And so we can create our own custom functions with Lua. I'm going to show you some of the ones that I use. So for example, leader PA is going to show us down the bottom here the exact file and the path that we're in. It's going to copy it to the clipboard, as you can see here with that plus sign. Okay. Next, we're going to create an auto command. This just creates a group. I'm going to create this one. It's going to be called user config, and this is just specific to my user config. And one thing, let's say before I mentioned that we have changed it so that Y, capital Y, we can copy to the end of a line. Well, what this next function does is it highlights when we copy. So for example, I can copy this and then I can hit Y, and then you can see it just flash that kind of orangey yellow color, and just gives us that feedback that we've copied that into our, in our case, into the clipboard. Okay. And so then there's a few other things, like we might want to return to the last edit position when we're opening the file. So let's say I'm here on line 141. I'm going to quit this file and I'm going to go back, NVim, okay, and here I'm going to go to the init.lua, and we're back on line 141. Okay. NeoVim actually has a built-in terminal, and I'm going to go through that in a minute. We're going to customize that terminal and we're going to pop it out. All right, so we won't waste too much time on this one. All this one does is that it auto closes the terminal when we're exiting a process, and then we've got auto resizing splits when window is resized. So say if your whole view is resized, and it's going to automatically resize the windows. And then finally, if you created a file and the directory doesn't yet exist, this is going to create that directory for you. So these are just some handy functions that you may use, and so you can go ahead and create your own custom functions. These are just some of the ones that I like. Okay, just a few command line options. So we're going to have a wild menu. So before we used color scheme, right? And so here we can simply just use tab and completion and so forth. And these are just some improvements here. Now, there's also some better diffing options. You can use NeoVim to diff, and also it's great when it comes to like your git diffs and so forth. We won't get into that in this tutorial, but it is super powerful. Then there's just a few options which include improve the performance, and finally a function which creates the undo dir. We set that at the beginning just so that we always know that we've got the ability to undo in files, and we can persist that across sessions. So if we come back, say in a month, to a server, we can go in and we can undo changes and so forth. Okay, so now we're getting to the really good stuff, all right? We're going to have a floating terminal. And so the configuration here basically just sets up a floating terminal. We've already got a terminal within NeoVim, but what I like about this is it pops out a terminal, and that terminal it persists. Okay, so I've mapped it to leader T, and we're going to see a lot of these items in here are to do with just the size, for example, of the terminal, so the height and the width, and turning off, for example, the relative line numbers and so forth. Those things don't mean anything to us in the terminal. And so we've got this, and if we come down to the bottom here, we can see that we've got leader T is our shortcut for the floating terminal. So I'm just going to run that, and now we can see we're in the terminal here, and I can simply say echo hello world. Okay, now if I hit escape, which is the next shortcut that I've got here, it's going to close the terminal. However, if I run it again, we've got the terminal, it's still there. Okay, so that's one really handy thing if you're working in the file and you need to quickly duck over. Of course, you can always press Control Z, and that will suspend your process, right? And you can bring that back to the foreground with FG, but sometimes it's just nice to have the terminal in front of you. Okay, so I mentioned before that we don't want the insert mode to be shown in the command, but the thing is, what we could have, and what a lot of people do with their custom NeoVim configurations, is they install a plugin like LuaLine or something, and that gives them a really nice, cool status line. Okay, but the thing is that we aren't using any plugins, right? We can't use LuaLine in this video, and so we're just going to create our very own status line. Okay, and so in here I'm going to have Git branches. We're going to have not necessarily icons, but we can see the exact type of file that we're in, say Python or Lua, HTML, Vim, whatever it may be. We're going to have the ability to have an LSP status, although I'm going to touch on that a little bit later. And we are going to have the word count, I don't know, just to have something, if it's a text file or a markdown file. We're going to have the size of the file, so how many kilobytes or megabytes the file is. And then we are going to have some indicators, whether we're in normal mode or insert mode, visual, select, command, whatever it may be. Okay, and so then we're going to set the colors on the status line, and we are going to have it bolded, and then here we're actually going to be setting the status line. Okay, so I'm going to write this, I'm going to apply it. Okay, and now you can see that we have our own status line. Of course, it's not quite as sexy as the ones that you get with LuaLine. Nevertheless, it does the job, right? So if we have here, we can see, okay, we're switching between these files and so forth. Let's say I go back to that Qtile project. We go to the config. I can see on this one over here that we are in a Python file, and then the one over here we're in a Lua file. Okay, so it just gives you that kind of like immediate feedback. Okay, so let's clean up here a little bit. I'm going to close that, and next we're going to touch on tabs. Now, to be honest, I don't use tabs a whole lot. However, they can be kind of useful if you don't have tmux or a terminal multiplexer, and you can get into that. You can look up tmux yourself, but sometimes that's overkill. Okay, still kind of handy. So let's say, much like in VS Code, you have a number of files open. You would probably consider it like in a way that you'd have files, right? But a tab is just a view, and it can have any number of buffers in it. Okay, and so here, if I write this and I source this, then I'm going to say we've got show tab line 1. This is an important thing because it says here if you never want to show your tab line up the top, you can have it 0. And if you've got 1, it means when you've got multiple tabs. So right now I don't actually have any multiple tabs. I can create a tab with this shortcut here. So we can say leader TN. Okay. NeoVim actually already has some built-in keybinds, and so what I can say is leader and then G space T, and that's going to take us back to the previous one. If we wanted to go to the next one, it's leader GT, just lowercase t. Okay, so let's see what we wanted to close this. We can say tab close, and now we're going to close it. So we could have also done leader TX. So let's say create a new one, and then leader TX, and now we've closed the tab. We can move the tabs around and so forth, and you can look into that in your own time. But the idea is that you can just have tabs, and they can become quite useful if you wanted to manage different views or different windows, or rather tabs is a concept, but if you just wanted to have them all in the one place. Okay, and this is kind of a good segue into buffers, just an introduction to buffers. When you open a file in NeoVim, then NeoVim's going to allocate a bit of memory for that file, a location for that file, okay? Now, you might only have one window and you might only be looking at one single buffer, but in fact, you've got tons of different buffers possibly in the background, depending on how many files that you've opened, okay? So when you open a new file, we go back to our Qtile project and we look at config. Now we actually have a buffer, all right? We can actually list our buffers with just the buffers command, and we can see all the buffers that we've got available. So we've actually got a couple here. Now, I've mapped it so that we've got BN, so leader BN will take us to our next buffer. Okay, and so we can shift through our buffers like that. Now, moving back and forth between buffers is kind of cumbersome, so what you can actually do is just say B and then space, and you can tab the file name. So for example, let's go to that init.lua file. Now we're back here. Okay, and now I mentioned that we've got LSP support, and that is very true, all right? Here I've got some example of some Shell and Python language servers. However, there's a proviso here. I need to tell you that this means that up until now, we've been working with, yes, no plugins, but also practically no dependencies. When we went to checkhealth, then we could always see, that NeoVim might be saying, okay, we've got no ripgrep. Yeah, everything's been working, but this is an external tool, which is really, really useful, and it will speed up your searching and so forth. But nevertheless, we are missing some of these dependencies and these different providers, and Tree Sitter, for example, is set up with some basic languages. But say if we wanted to, Tree Sitter works out of the box with Lua, right? But it doesn't work out of the box with Python, for example. The point being that you can actually set up an LSP, and I've set up an LSP here, and don't be too confused by all of this. It just means that I've mapped with the Python language server, and with black as a formatter, I can go to definition, and I can look at I can hover on things. So let's go and have a look at this. All right, and so now we're up here, and let's say I want to have a look at something. I'm going to have a look at my auto start script. I can use leader capital D, and it'll take me there. And this is where it starts to become really, really powerful, and you're like on the edge of really being in VS Code or whatever it may be. However, I'm going to stop myself right there, okay? Because this is the perfect point at which you need to now consider if you're going to be using NeoVim with LSP and you want to have formatting and linting and everything. Okay, this is the moment where you want to have a configuration which is a bit more powerful and leverages some of the really awesome plugins out there within the broader ecosystem. Okay, so my contention is this is the spot, okay? This is the spot where the abstraction becomes useful, and you've learned enough about NeoVim that you can kind of get your way around. You're familiar with a little bit of Lua, and so you can work with NeoVim now. You can grow in, and you're going to find after like a year that working with NeoVim is way better than pretty much everything else out there on the market. Of course, there are other great IDEs, and there's a time and a place maybe for them. I don't use them, but maybe you do. That's fine. Okay, so I think I've shown to you how powerful NeoVim is in this video. I think I haven't even shown you, 5% of what NeoVim has, and yet we've already built a little editor which is super powerful and super useful. And you could use this on all kinds of machines, like I said earlier, on servers and barebone machines and everything, without the heavy LSPs and all these kind of dependencies. I hope that that's been a good introduction. I think this is a really good place to start, and even for people who've been using NeoVim for years like myself, this is still a very good spot to kind of like have this up your back sleeve, have it in your quiver, so you can whip it out and you can use NeoVim without all the bulk and the bloat. Okay, so thanks very much for tuning in, and I hope to see you back at the channel soon.